Good morning. There we go. We're trying again. So glad that you're joining us this morning. I'd like to say so glad to see you, but of course you know that today we are virtual, and so even though we are not together in one place, it's a great day to worship the Lord together. Um, at Grace Bible Church, we value gathering, and so it is particularly sad to not be together today in person, but we know that that separation is short, and we will be together again very soon. In fact, next week we're planning to return to meeting together in person, but we will be observing some protocols to make sure that we stay as safe as we can from the virus that is spreading in our community. So we ask that next week, as we return to normal services, that you would please keep some distance and also go ahead and wear a mask, so that we can be as responsible as we can in curbing the spread in the surge we're experiencing in our community. Um, so even though we are having virtual services last week and this week, our adult CT class has continued to proceed, and excuse me. And those recordings are going to be on our YouTube channel, or are on our YouTube channel, so you should definitely check that out. Other CT classes that we have are going to be resuming next week when we're back in person. All right, so again, starting next week, next Sunday night, our youth program will kick off. So that's Word of Life Youth Ministry. And so if you're in the 5th through the 12th grade, please do come check us out, 5 p.m. Sunday night next week. Ladies Ministry. Okay, so with Ladies Ministry, we have the fall kickoff for that group as well coming up. That's September 18th, and that'll be with a visit to Lake Norman from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. So there'll be lunch, and that'll be at noon at the traditional lunchtime. And just bring a chair, bring some salad or a finger food to share. And if you want more information, you can get in touch with Cindy Young or Michelle Brilliant. There is a sign up link that's posted online too, so that you can let people know if you're coming and what you'll be bringing. Still on the topic of ladies ministry, they have the Ladies Fall Bible Study that is scheduled to start soon. That's September 21st for the Tuesday night group and September 24th for the Friday morning group. And no one's assigned to a group. You can choose which group you want to attend with. But that's 7 p.m. on Tuesday night or 9:30 a.m. on Friday morning. And the study is going to be a study in 1 Peter by Jen Wilkin. If you would like to have a book of your very own to follow along with, which we would recommend, you can get that yourself on Amazon or wherever you like, or you can get in touch with Rose Bolden, and she will get one ordered for you in time for the study. Children's ministry. Okay, so the fall kickoff for our Sunday morning children's ministry it's going to be today, but you can see we are virtual. So that's been delayed till next week when we're all back together. So if you are interested in helping with that ministry, there are definitely opportunities available for you to get involved. So see Crystal Dry or Jason Brilliant to get involved there. The Cornhole Tournament is coming up. So September 19th is when the tournament will be held. That's in 2 Sundays from now. It'll be after church, and we'll have lunch, which will be hot dogs, brats, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the Cornhole Tournament will begin. So when you get back to the building, you can sign up in person in the info booth. There will be a sheet. Or if you don't want to wait that long, you can also check out the Facebook page, the Grace Church People Facebook page, and there's a post there related to the tournament, and you can indicate that you would like to participate there. Entry fee is going to be $20, same as last year, so still a bargain for all of the fun. And then finally, last announcement for this morning, the men's retreat. Okay, so last but certainly not least, the men's retreat. It's a great time. I was there last year. It was a great time with the men of this church, digging into God's Word together, and also just kind of getting to know one another even more. And so I expect this year is going to be very much the same. Lots of good teaching and lots of good fellowship. That's October 14th through 16th. So about a month from now, we'll be heading down there to Buckhead Ranch in Latta, South Carolina. So if you would like to attend that trip, get in touch with Jason. It'll cost you $100 to reserve your spot, and just $95 more before the trip starts. So 195 total. So dudes, sign up, okay? And if you're not a dude, you can't come, but you can sign your dude up. All right? So get them on the list. Okay. All right, so that's all the announcements that I have for today. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Jason for our message this morning.
If I could piggyback off of that for just a minute, sign your dude up, right? We need some dudes to sign up. We need more dudes. In fact, I say in all seriousness, if you're signed up for the men's retreat and you have a dad, a brother, a neighbor, a coworker, someone for whom you think that trip would be a blessing, sign them up. Like, give them the information, send them the video, the link to the YouTube video. Let them see what it is that we're going to be doing. We would love to have a few extra guys to help round out this trip. We do have a few spots left, so put the word out, right? So definitely share that. All right, today we're going to be in the book of Joshua. We're in the middle of the book in our study entitled Moving Forward. And in this study, we're really seeing some themes or some patterns emerge. And there's a specific pattern that I want to draw attention to today. And I'm hoping that it's going to mean something special to you as we look at this together. As we look at Joshua chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, and even moving forward, what we begin to see is a pattern emerge, a pattern of failure, and then a pattern of renewal, where we see God take the failures, the sinful defeats, the tragedies, the consequences, and he takes those things and he turns them from defeat into victory. And so this pattern of God turning our defeat into victory it's our theme for today. That's what we're going to be looking at. You know, God is constantly moving us from somewhere to somewhere. We don't have to look far in the scriptures to see that that's the case. God took the Israelites from Egypt into the promised land. He took them from Egypt first to the wilderness, from the wilderness to the promised land. When we look at the gospel of Jesus, it's taking us from bondage and slavery to sin into the blessings and the promises of God and salvation and eternal life. And God is taking us from slavery to sin into a place of obedience and walking with Him in victory. And so God is constantly has a path for us to walk. There's, as long as we have breath, as long as He gives us life, there's an opportunity for us to take another step forward every day, another step forward on His path. And so He's moving us from somewhere to somewhere. And so one of the things that can happen, though, is when we experience a tragic, personal, spiritual failure, okay, sin in our lives, it can have a tendency to paralyze us and cause us to not want to take that next step forward. But what I think we see in Scripture today, and what I want us to notice is that God has a next step for us, right? And we can get on that next step. And God is not slow about being all in to provide a firm foundation for us to take that next spiritual step forward. God wants to take us from a place of defeat into a place of victory. So with that being said, let's go ahead and turn in our Bibles this morning to Joshua chapter 8. And we'll begin looking at the beginning of chapter 8. And again, chapter 8 really comes right after this huge spiritual defeat in chapter 7. So chapter 7, last week, we talked about how the sin of Achan and Joshua's failure to seek God's advice on the battle at Ai just had horrible consequences. In fact, chapter 7 ends with a tremendous spiritual defeat, right? And there's such potential for discouragement. But God said, I'll no longer be with you until you deal with this sin problem. And what we see is the nation of Israel, they took him seriously. They dealt with the sin problem. They got it out into the open. They confessed it, graciously accepted the consequences. And then it says at the end of chapter 7, if you'll look with me at the very last verse, it says, then God turned from His burning anger. Okay, now, you and I can sometimes have a tendency to think that God thinks the way we would think about us. So like if I'm God and I'm thinking about me the way that I think about me, I can think that God might be reluctant to want to be back involved in my life after such a tragic instance as this. You know, when I'm considering my path in life and I consider my personal sin, and if I can see that sin clearly in my rearview mirror, like I just haven't really had a lot of time elapse. Like that sin is just near in my past, and I can have this tendency to think, if God were to think like we think, I can have this tendency to believe that God may just not want to be all in. Like He just may not want to be 100% committed to me. If I think about myself in that way, or I think that God thinks that way about me, I can have a tendency to believe that maybe God wants me to earn my way back into His favor. When my failure is close behind me in my rearview mirror, I can have a tendency to think that maybe I need to earn my way back, show God that I'm really serious this time, maybe put some miles between me and my last failure, so that God will have a basis upon which to maybe be more invested in my life. But that's actually not what we see here. In fact, after this tremendous spiritual defeat in chapter 7, we see God turning from His burning anger in verse 26. And in the very next sentence, look at what it says. Chapter 8, verse 1. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people and his city and his land. And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king. Only its spoil and livestock you shall take as plunder for yourselves, lay an ambush against the city behind it." And so what we see is that coming off of this spiritual, personal, and national spiritual failure in chapter 7, that He is all in. He is all in. He's not making them put some miles between their last defeat and a renewed fellowship and God being in 100%. Like God is not making them have a particular period of time elapse, and God's not holding back like we would do us if we were God. And so God is all in. How in is God? It says that in the very first verse, do not fear and do not be dismayed. What is God saying? God's saying, I'm with you. I'm with you. I'm here to help you secure the victory. God also goes on to say, behold, I have given into your hand the king of Ai and his people, his city, his land. God says, I'm going to help you have this victory. I'm going to procure it for you, right? I'm not waiting on you to earn your way back into my favor. I'm going to do this because this is the kind of faithful God that I am. God goes on to say, not only is He going to give them the victory, but He said, oh, and the spoil, the treasure, the plunder, it's yours. Remember, I promised that to you, and I'm not going back on my promise, because that's the kind of God that I am. God is back in, and He's in 100%. So God's going to give them the victory. He's going to be with them. He's going to allow them to have the spoil, and look at verse 2. He said, I'm going to give you the military strategy to do it with. Lay an ambush against the city behind it. And we see that God actually gives Joshua a wonderful battle plan. Can I say that it was brilliant? It was a brilliant battle plan. But this battle plan is awesome. He said, you're going to lay an ambush behind the city. And we read in the following verses that Joshua took 30,000 men up to the city of Ai, and it was at night, so they couldn't be seen. And Joshua divided up the force according to the words of God. He took 5,000 of those men, and they went into hiding, to lay an ambush behind the city. The others went out in a very visible way and actually went out in front of the gates of the city where they could be seen, these 25,000 troops. And they went to do battle against the city of Ai. So when the sun rose that day, the men of Ai saw the forces of the Israelites, these 25,000 soldiers, in front of their gates. And they said, oh, look, they're back, right? And they go back and they get their fighting men from the city, and they open the gates and they go out and they do battle with the Israelites, these 25,000 soldiers. But the only thing that they didn't know was that God had a plan. And God's plan was to draw the enemy out into this place, this with this false sense of security, to draw them out. And like before, the men of Israel were going to tuck tail and to run. But this time is part of God's plan. So they tuck tail and run on purpose to draw the men of Ai out away from their city, and they fall for it. I mean, hook, line, and sinker, they fall for it. And God absolutely was pre-planning this victory for Israel. How in is God? God is all the way in. God draws them out from the city using their consequences from their former failure. Did you catch that? What is it that's catching the city of Ai off guard? Right? It's that their false sense of confidence. That the Israelites had come up previously. Remember chapter 7? They'd come up before the gate, climbed up the slope. Remember, Ai is on a slope. So they'd got up to this elevation of the city, and the men of Ai came out, and the Israelites were so scared that they tucked tail and ran. And so the men of Ai chased them downhill and just routed them on the way down. So they're looking at this and they're saying, "Oh, it was so easy last time. This time it's going to be a piece of cake again. We're going to go out and we're going to whoop these Israelites." And so they had this false sense of security that God absolutely uses against them and for the benefit of the Israelites. And so what we see in this is that God is not only is he all the way in, right, in this battle. He's back, he's with his people, he's reconfirming his promise, he's giving them the spoil, he's giving them this victory, he's giving them the strategy, and the strategy incorporates elements of their former defeat. And so I think there's such an awesome thing that God can take our failure and out of our failure bring about victory. And so we go on to read, and we won't read all the verses, but we read in chapter 8 that it plays out exactly the way that God had orchestrated it. The men of Ai come out. They're completely caught off guard. They fall into this sense of false sense of security. They come out. They chase the men of Israel, and while they're doing that, the 5,000 men that are in hiding, they come in, and the people in Ai had left the gates open in the city. So these 5,000 men, they go in, they set the city on fire. And while the city is burning and the smoke from that is going up, the 5,000 men then join up with the other 25,000, and they sandwich the warriors of Ai in between these two sides, and they absolutely rout them. In fact, as we read the way that chapter 8, the way this plays out, read with me beginning in verse 18. It says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Stretch out the javelin that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand.'" Boy, does that sound like Moses with the staff, holding it up over the Red Sea. But he says, "Joshua, hold the javelin out," and he said, "I'm going to give it into your hand, the city of Ai." Joshua stretched out the javelin that it was in his hand toward the city, and the men in ambush rose quickly out of their place. As soon as he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city, captured it, and they hurried to set the city on fire. So when the men of Ai looked back, behold, the smoke of the city went up to heaven, and it said they had no power to flee this way or that, for the people who fled to the wilderness, that was Joshua and the 25,000, turned back against their pursuers. And when the Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had captured the city and the smoke of the city went up, it says they turned back and they struck down the men of Ai. And the others came out from the city against them, so that they were in the midst of Israel, some on this side, some on that side. And Israel struck them down until there was left none that survived or escaped. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him near to Joshua. Now, as this battle's finishing up, verse 24 says, "When Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, all of them to the very last had fallen by the edge of the sword. Israel returned to Ai and struck it down with the edge of the sword. And all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. But Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all of the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. Only the livestock and the spoil of that city Israel took as their plunder, according to the word of the Lord that he commanded Joshua." So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins as it is to this day. And he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset, Joshua commanded, they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance to the gate of the city and raised over it a great heap of stones, which stands there to this day. So, a couple of thoughts on this section. First of all, the one thing that we don't want to miss here is that, of course, this is a very violent ending. Okay, we're going to talk about that. But first, I just want to point out that Joshua is absolutely fulfilling the word of God. He's doing exactly what God has commanded him to do. And I think that's really to Joshua's credit. Now, I do want to remind you here just for a moment, this is particularly useful when we get to chapter 9, is that God has really given them three different ways in which they are to deal with the inhabitants of the land. When they cross the Jordan, there are three different ways in which they're to deal with the different inhabitants based on where they live. God's very specific. He said, when you get to the city of Jericho, remember what did he say about the city? It was to be devoted to destruction. The very first city, very special. He said, you're going to devote it to destruction. Everything that lives, it dies, right? As part of God's judgment upon that city. And we're going to see some principles at work here. But this first city is God's. He said, it's mine. It's devoted to destruction. You're not taking any plunder, not taking any spoil. Everything dies. And if it doesn't die, it gets burned. Okay, that's Jericho. Now, when they move into the promised land, into Canaan, so the land of the Jebusites, the Hivites, these cities that we're going to read about in chapter 9 and 10. Okay, when you get to those cities, God said, this is very specifically, he said, you're to kill the inhabitants, all of them, all the people are to die. But the plunder, the spoil, that's yours. You can keep it. But all the people, okay, men, women, children, they're to be devoted to destruction. God did say that, and Joshua is doing that. And to us, that can sound really violent, and I understand how, as Christians, we might have a little trouble with that. But keep in mind, first of all, so why is this acceptable? Well, number one, God told them to do it. Okay, God doesn't say for us to go out and to commit warfare and to destroy anyone that's not a believer. He's not saying that. That's not what God's even telling them here. But God's saying in this particular region, at this particular time, you're going to be instruments of my judgment over sin. And so what we see is God's justice at work here. God has said, and previously, over 400 years before this, he said, I'm going to use this nation of Israel, who's not perfect, but I'm going to use them to judge this region of Canaan. He said, we're going to judge these people because of their idolatry, because of their sin. And as we said a few weeks ago, one of the sins that God particularly hated and that he was judging at this time was the sacrifice of their children to Molech. The people in Jericho and Ai and these central regions in the land of Canaan were sacrificing their children. They would take newborn infants and they would throw them in the fire and burn them up for sacrifices to this false god known as Molech. And God said, I absolutely hate that. And he said, I'm giving them space to repent. God gave them over 400 years to do that. And now God is using the Israelites to judge that sin. So God's justice is absolutely at work here. But having said that, God said there's three different ways that they were to deal with the cities. So Jericho, complete destruction. The land of Canaan, they're to kill all the inhabitants but keep the spoil. But when you get further out than that, okay, they were allowed to make peace with those nations. In fact, God said, and he did not tell them to kill the inhabitants of nations, outside of that. He said, in fact, you could make covenants with them. You can make peace with them. That's fine. And God made provision for that. So God's justice was not like a wholesale thing that they were just to execute everywhere. No, it was a very specific region at a very specific time. And it was for the purpose of judging sin, not just to evict the inhabitants to make room for Israel. So we need to keep that in mind. And that, again, plays a lot into what we're going to see in chapter 9 and 10. So God's justice is very visible here, but also, can I just say this? God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness is absolutely in view here. We see that God did not hold back. Okay, even though the Israelites did not deserve his grace, they did not deserve, just like we don't deserve it, they did not deserve his grace. They came off of this failure in chapter 7, right? And if I'm God looking at me and I'm looking at that failure, okay, I'm not all in chapter 8, but God is. And I think sometimes we can feel like our personal failure really prohibits God from being all in, and that's not the case, because God is faithful. He's faithful to keep his promise. He's faithful to never leave our side. Can I share something with you? I think this is just a great passage, and I want to share it with you today. It's from Psalm 37. So if you turn over there with me just for a moment, this is how God operates, and I think it's such a testimony to his faithfulness. I'm reading from Psalm 37, verse 23 and 24. And it says this: "The steps of a man are established by the Lord when he delights in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong." Or some translations say, shall not be utterly destroyed or utterly cast down. "For the Lord upholds his hand." And so when we consider what that means, when we consider these two verses, the steps of a man are established by the Lord. We said earlier that God always has us moving forward. Like he always has a path for us. As long as we're drawing breath, and it's called today, God has a plan for us, and it involves us moving forward. And as we take those steps, right, and we're taking them in God's direction, like we're taking steps of obedience, steps of faith. Every time we reach out with our foot and we go to set it down, it says when that's God's path, God establishes those steps. He causes that to be firm footing underneath, right? I'm reminded of that hymn, and I'm sure you've probably heard it. "On Christ, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." When we're taking that step forward and it's God's plan, when we delight in his way, God has such a faithfulness to us to make that solid footing. And he does that. And he's doing that here with the nation of Israel. Did they deserve that? Absolutely not. Do we deserve it? Absolutely not. But God in his faithfulness creates the firm foundation for us to put our foot when that next step we're delighting in his way. I love this. It says, though he fall, he shall not be cast headlong, or he shall not be utterly cast down. Do we misstep? Do we deviate from God's path? Absolutely. And is that sinking sand? Absolutely. Are we going to fall? Yes, we do. We fall. But what's the picture here? That God has us by the hand. And he is absolutely 110% committed to helping us up and providing that firm foundation for the very next step that we're to take in his direction, if we're willing to do that. And so I think it's such a beautiful picture. I'm reminded of Peter stepping out on the water, following Jesus. Jesus was able to make that surface tension of the water hold up Peter's foot. And he was able to do that. Now, when Peter took his eyes off of Jesus, now he began to sink. But who had him by the hand? Jesus. And I believe that's the way that he's doing me and you today. God is so faithful. Back to chapter 9, chapter 8. Let's finish up the chapter. We have a couple other things to look at. It says at the end of chapter 8, I'm going to look at verse 30 and following. It says, "At that time," so after this victory at Ai, "Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones, upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord, sacrificed peace offering." So what are they doing here? They're having a worship service. Right here, after this battle, they're out in the wilderness between these two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, and they're going to have a worship service. So check this out. So it says that there, in the presence of the people of Israel, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. In fact, other passages tell us that he plastered the stones, and in the wet plaster he wrote out the law that God had given to Moses, an exact copy, second copy. He transcribed it. And so he wrote on the stones the copy of the law of Moses. And then in verse 33, all Israel sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officers and judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. Afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before the assembly of Israel, the women, the little ones, and the sojourners who lived among them. I mean, what a picture. So this is actually several things going on in this passage. First of all, they're having a worship service. What a better time to have a worship service. They have just come off this wonderful victory that God has manipulated on their behalf. And so they're out here, and so, hey, let's just stop and worship God. Let's worship Him right where we are. Now, what's interesting is that they just happen to be in this geographic location with which God has associated a particular promise. And that promise is recorded back in Deuteronomy chapter 11. It's also repeated in Deuteronomy 27. And way back when it was Moses leading the people, they're back in the wilderness, and God is talking to Moses about what He's going to do for the people. He mentions this. He says, and it's almost like a prophecy in a sense. He said, when you get into the promised land and you get west of Jordan, okay, not if you get there, but when you get there, you're going to come to this place where you've got Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And when you get there, here's what you're going to do. You're going to have a rededication service. And what you're going to do, Moses command the people, okay, and now Moses is gone, so it's Joshua. Joshua command the people to divide up into two groups. You're going to have, these tribes over here in front of this mountain. You're going to have these tribes over here in front of this mountain. And in the middle, you've got the Ark of God. You've got this, the Ark of God, the Levitical priests, and you've kind of got this no man's land in the middle. And what the people were instructed to do is very interesting. And from a teacher's point of view, this is appealing to different learning styles. Okay, he's actually having the people act something out, and it's great for the teacher brain. Okay, so he's having this side over here represent in front of Mount Ebal the curse that's in the law, and he's having the ones in front of Mount Gerizim represent the blessing. And so what the groups of people did was they faced each other and they shouted back and forth the terms of the curse and the blessing that are in the law. And it's almost like a spiritual Red Rover, okay? And so they're talking back and forth and they're shouting back and forth the terms. And so this side is reminding the other side, hey, if we don't follow God and we don't, take that next step, delighting in His way where He can create a firm foundation, this is what's going to happen. God is going to cause us to have pestilence and famine, and we're going to go into captivity. Okay, and over here on this side, this group is shouting over the terms of the blessing. And, well, if we follow God and we delight in His way, we trust Him, we're obedient, then God is going to cause us to have victory, and He's going to cause us to have health and prosperity and abundance, and we're going to enjoy our days. We're going to enjoy the promised land. And so they're reminding each other of these two different sides of the promise that God has given them. And so what a great reminder. But the way that God has it organized, and I think this is really important, is He has them organized in a way where you're either on this side or you're on this side, right? There's really no middle ground, and I think that's so, there's so much application for that. I mean, when we think about today, that next step that each of us take in the Christian life, we're either stepping on a place where God has created a firm foundation, or we're stepping on sinking sand. Okay, it's one or the other. We're either over here or we're over here. Nobody's riding the fence. And so with each step, we have a choice. Are we going to step where God is creating a firm foundation? Are we going to delight in His way, or are we not? Anyway, back to the theme here. So what we're seeing is really God creating victory out of our defeat. Let's look at chapter 9 quickly. I do want to take a look at this. This is a great chapter, short chapter, but it says this: as soon as the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country and the lowland all along the coast of the Great Sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, and the other ites. I'm not even sure how to say all of those. As soon as they heard of this, it says they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. Now listen to this. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they on their part acted with cunning. Now, who is Gibeon? Where are the Gibeonites from? Well, the Gibeonites, remember earlier we said that God had 3 different ways of dealing with the people in the land. Jericho, devote to destruction. The land of Canaan, devote the people to destruction, but you can keep the stuff. And then beyond that, in the very, very far away country, okay, you can make peace with those nations. Okay, Gibeon was in that second group. They were in the group that God said, destroy the people, keep the stuff. Okay, that was the area that Gibeon was from. In fact, Gibeon was so close to where Joshua and the people were at that they could almost see them from there. 25 miles was really how far they were away. But the Gibeonites, they are clever. Listen to this. Listen to what they do. It says they acted with cunning on their part. They're slick. It says they made ready provisions and took worn-out sacks for their donkeys, wineskins, worn out, torn, and mended, with worn-out patched sandals on their feet and worn-out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him, the men of Israel, we've come from a distant country. Distant country? 25 miles? I don't think so. He says, so now make a covenant with us. And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, well, perhaps you live among us. How then can we make a covenant with you? And they said to Joshua, we are your servants. Joshua said to them, who are you? And where do you come from? And they said to him, from a very distant country. Right, very distant country. From a very distant country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, Og the king of Bashan who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them and say, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as food for the journey on the day that we set out to come to you, but now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So the men, meaning the men of Israel, took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So how smooth are the Gibeonites? Well, they're pretty slick, apparently. They were able to fool Joshua and the leaders of Israel completely. And the way they did that was they manipulated them, first of all, with the dress-up act, the old wineskin and the dirty clothes and the old moldy bread and all of that. And so they go and they tell them we're from a very far country, knowing that the Joshua was allowed to make peace with those from a very far country, but he was not allowed to make peace with those who were from the region of the Canaanites. So they go with this story, right? What they also do is very, very clever. They don't mention the victory at Jericho. They don't mention the victory at Ai. And the reason why is because those were recent victories. And these guys, if they're really from a very far country, okay, they didn't have the internet and CNN and Fox News and all that, so they wouldn't have known about that yet. And so they show up, and they are mentioning these really old victories, way back in the Bashan and all these other places. So they wouldn't have had any recent news if they're from a very far country. So they come in with this very believable story, and you know what? The Israelites probably wanted to believe it, okay? Because it's kind of flattering in a way. I mean, if you're Israel and these people come in and they're so far away and they come in and they want to make peace, I mean, what does that feed? Okay, it feeds my flesh because I want to think that, well, yes, if I was from a very far country, I would fear me too. And, Yes, our God is wonderful and great and very powerful. And yes, we do have a mighty military force. And yes, you should be afraid of us. And so they want to believe it, and it looks believable, but they're being deceived. And folks, I just want to share with you today that we have an enemy that is very slick, that he is very crafty. He works against us to get us today as believers in Jesus. He works against us to get us to make a covenant with sin. And he uses some of the same tactics. You know, we have an enemy, the Bible tells us, that prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. But, you know, even though that is his goal, that is his strategy, he does not always look like a prowling lion seeking to devour something. You know, the Bible tells us that Satan and Satan's helpers have the ability to masquerade as angels of light. Okay, their message, like the message of the Gibeonites, it can look good, it can smell good, it can taste good, it can, just have every appearance of being above board and good and right and true. But when it comes down to it, it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so, just as Joshua was fooled here, we too can be fooled today. But notice back to our chapter, where did the mistake take place? Where was the mistake in this chapter? It's right there in verse 14. What was it? It says they did not seek counsel from the Lord. You know, today, you know, the Bible tells us that we're not ignorant of Satan's devices. We're not ignorant of his strategies. I mean, we know what his strategies are, but Satan is still able to fool us when we don't seek wisdom from God. But the good news is, the Bible tells us that wisdom is freely available. James 1:5 tells us this: if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. And so there's this idea that, you know, we was promised that if we lack wisdom, but the problem is, do we think we lack wisdom? Like if I'm Joshua here and the leaders of Israel, okay, I think I've got all the facts, and I think I know what I'm doing, but do I? The chances are good that we don't. And without God's wisdom, okay, the enemy is too much for us. They are too slick for us. And so we need God's wisdom, right? So if any of you lacks wisdom, James 1:5 says, I think it really, it's really like if we lack wisdom. Do we lack wisdom? Absolutely we lack wisdom. But sometimes it's getting us to recognize that we lack wisdom, right? We don't always want to think that. But the promise is there. If we lack wisdom, if we're willing to say, yes, I need you, God. Yes, I need your direction. Yes, I don't know enough on my own. I need your direction. I need your counsel. It says, ask God, and he gives it. How does he give it? Generously, to all, without reproach. God never gets tired of being asked for wisdom. He never gets tired of us coming to him for things, for advice. It says it will be given him. But Joshua, so they don't seek for wisdom. They don't look for God's counsel. They make a covenant with the Gibeonites, and verse 16 says at the end of 3 days, they find out that they got hoodwinked. It says after 3 days after they made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. Oh, that's a sinking feeling if you're Joshua. It says the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then the congregation murmured or grumbled against their leaders. Do leaders ever mess up? Yes. Did these guys mess up? Yes. And they're grumbling about it. But now it's a done deal. I mean, what can you do? It says, but the leader said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, by the God of Israel, now we may not touch them. And so there's this commitment to keeping this promise. We covenanted with them to not destroy them, and we have to keep that. We have to keep our word. Now, as a modern reader today, you and I would look at this, and we would say, this is a second mistake. Okay, because they lied to us, obviously, so why don't we go back and why don't we, take them out? I mean, the terms of the covenant were based on this false information they were feeding us, so don't we have the right now to go back and to clobber these guys? I mean, that should let us out of the contract, right? Well, actually, it doesn't. And here's how we know that it doesn't. The reason is because God's name is on this contract. They have sworn to them by the Lord. And because God's name is on this contract, God is not allowing them out of it. Even though, was it a wrong move? Absolutely. Should they have made the contract, the covenant? They should not. But actually now, because God's name is on it, they can't get out of it, right? And they're going to have to keep it. In fact, if we go forward, this is how serious God takes it. When we go up into 2 Samuel, so like 400 years later, during the days of David, what we find is that God still remembers this covenant, and he's still expecting them to keep the terms of this covenant. Even though the Gibeonites lied, even though 300 or 400 years have passed, what we see in 2 Samuel 21 is that King David seeks the Lord because there's a famine in the land, 3-year famine. And David goes to the Lord and says, Lord, why is this famine happening? You promised that we would have food and crops and all this. And if we're having a famine, that means something's off in our fellowship. Something's wrong. And God said, yes, David, absolutely. And he said, here's the problem. He said, your predecessor, Saul, killed some of the Gibeonites. And God is absolutely holding them accountable to this promise that they shouldn't have made, but he's holding them to it. In fact, so much so that David has to go to the Gibeonites and say, hey, guys, King Saul, the guy before me, he messed up. And he had some of you guys killed. So what can we do to make this right? And David has to make it right for the famine to end. So does God take his covenant seriously? He absolutely does. And that has implications for us today. I mean, we today in our culture, we don't do much what we consider like covenant making. We have a lot of what we call contracts. Okay, but covenants are a little different. A covenant, okay, when God has his name on it, okay, one of the few covenants that we make like that is marriage. Okay, and so, if we're to take a lesson from this, the Gibeonites, they fed false information, and the promise was based on false information. God expected them to keep that because his name was on it. When we consider marriage today, you can look back and, heard people say before, well, getting married was a mistake. Shouldn't have got married. Shouldn't have made that promise. Well, if I'd have known they weren't serious, or if I'd have known that she was going to do this, or if I'd have known he was going to be this way, or if I'd have known this person wasn't going to change. Should we have made that promise? Okay, in some cases, maybe it was a wrong choice. But God says, my name is on that covenant. And God takes it seriously. And so, if nothing else, I think we can take that from this passage. But what does God do? God redeems it, okay? God takes the situation. Should they have done that? No. But God takes it and he's able to redeem it. And what we see is that they actually take the Gibeonites and actually make them, in a sense, servants. They make them servants. And the Gibeonites are cool with it. They say, yeah, you're going to let us live. We'll do whatever, Joshua. You just tell us. And the chapter ends with Joshua saying, he said, you're going to be woodcutters and water bearers for the house of God. The house of God, it hasn't even been built yet. He said, you are going to serve it by cutting firewood and bringing water. And that actually turns out to be a great arrangement. God redeems that mistake in such a way that the Gibeonites are good with it. They begin bringing firewood and water for the nation of Israel and then later to the temple. And what a better place to have a bunch of pagan, idolatrous folks than to be carrying wood and water to the temple, where they're going to get such a picture of who God is. In fact, this worked out so well, and God was able to redeem this failure and turn it into a victory so thoroughly that the Gibeonites, we actually find that they actually delighted in their service to the Lord. In fact, when we read forward, that past the period of the judges, past the period of the kings, on past the Babylonian captivity, when Nehemiah and they come back from Babylon to rebuild the temple, and they're bringing back this small remnant of people who are going to rebuild this temple and serve. Do you know who was among that remnant? There were descendants of Gibeon that were among that group and who were excited to come back and to serve in God's house. And what a way to redeem. I mean, what a story, what a testimony. And when we consider all of these things, we consider the failure in chapter 7, followed by God's recommitment to victory in chapter 8. We consider the failure in chapter 9, and then we're going to read in chapter 10 the way that God redeems that mistake. I mean, what we're left with is the fact that God absolutely is interested in leading us into a place of victory out of our failure, out of our defeat. A couple things we'll just close with today. Share with you this. James chapter 4 tells us that God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. You know, God opposes the proud. It says, you know, when God opposes the proud, okay, are those of us who think we don't need him. We don't need his wisdom. We think we've got it figured out. We think that we like Joshua, we've got this, I've got it all under control battle plan. And, you know, we think we know what the Gibeonites are up to. Okay, we can think that in our pride, that our flesh has got it figured out and has a plan for victory. Okay, and God's not for that. He's not going to provide a firm foundation for that kind of thinking. But it says that God gives grace to the humble. God gives grace. When we consider, what does grace mean? It means unmerited favor. It means something good that we don't deserve. What was chapter 8 full of? Right after chapter 7's defeat, what was chapter 8 full of? It was full of God providing victory, providing help, providing a battle plan, providing wisdom, providing this battle strategy. Everything that they needed and more was theirs. Why? Because they were humble. It's because they sought him, because they acknowledged their sin. The Bible also says this is a passage I'm sure you're familiar with. Romans 8:28 says this. It says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are the called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. You know, when we consider our sin and our failing and the consequences associated with that, it's hard to see anything good in that sometimes. But God is able to take that and to work that out for good. You know, if God can take Achan's sin and Israel's failing to seek him in chapter 7 and turn it into victory in chapter 8, and if he's able to take their mess up with Gibeon and turn it into a victory in chapter 10, then God can absolutely take the broken pieces of your life today and he can make something awesome out of it if we're willing to humble ourselves and to seek his wisdom. And so God can absolutely bring defeat out of our victory. And he can do that, and he is willing to do it as fast as we're willing to admit our sin and to confess it to him. You know, as soon as we're willing to do that and we begin to seek him and draw near, God is committed at that moment to begin redeeming our failure and turning it for a victory. And so, end today with a question. What kind of baggage today might there be in your life? What kind of consequences are you dealing with maybe due to sin? Is there sin that's close behind you in your rearview mirror? I mean, are you thinking today that maybe that you need to put some miles between your last failure and God beginning to help you again and be involved in your life? Well, if that's you today, I just want to ask you this. You know, have you turned that over to God? Have you turned that shipwreck of sin, have you turned that over to him? Have you admitted it before God? Have you humbled yourself before him? And have you sought his wisdom and said, God, I need you. God, I need your wisdom. I need your counsel. I need your direction. And God is waiting today for us to turn to him. And he's got us by the hand. And he's waiting to put that firm foundation under our next step if we're willing to acknowledge him and to trust his way. And God will be right there. And so let's close today with a word of prayer. Father, today we're so thankful that you're willing to take us from a place of spiritual defeat into a place of spiritual victory. Thank you for your great faithfulness to us, that even when we don't deserve it, and we ought to have to earn our way back to you, we ought to have to show you that we're serious, and we ought to do a lot of things that we don't do. Thank you that you are never, ever done with us. and that you love us so completely and so thoroughly that you're willing to be involved in our lives. And Lord, we just thank you for it today. In Jesus' name, amen.